So 8 years ago, I made a presentation before the PA in Colorado about the possibility of parapsychology gaining legitimacy through uncovering the genes which are related to anomalous experience. And after the presentation, Stanley Krippner came up to me and said that what the audience would really like to see is methods which seem to improve the possibility of gaining the anomalous experience. So I'll be addressing that issue today with this field experiment, a sociological field experiment in a group PK psychokinesis.
I'll be talking about online group PK experiments. Now, I'll be using a grounded theory approach, and that differs from traditional parapsychological paradigms. You start off by collecting data, you code similar concepts, you form the concepts into categories, and this process allows you to look very closely at the data, and that will result in theory development, and you can generate hypotheses, and then you go through this cycle around and around, gathering data, coding concepts, forming concepts into categories, generating the theory, testing hypotheses, and you end up with a theory development. And it's a method that's designed to work with qualitative data to result in theories. And I think it's particularly appropriate for psychical research. So I'm going to be describing a participant observation field study, and it's like a metaphor for shamanism. First, I'll discuss previous participant observations work that I've done in the past. I'll review 2 theories. I'll devise and test 3 hypotheses. Then we'll note how those results shape beliefs, and we'll consider how those findings apply to the sociology of religion. If you know nothing about it, you could start off by reading Durkheim's work, and he mentions the idea of collective consciousness, and there's room for theory development in this area. So participant observation doesn't involve proving that the phenomena is paranormal. You just observe the people in the field, and you take notes. So I've observed shamanic practitioners all through Asia. In this example case, this Korean lady's gone into trance, and she has special clothes for the trance personality. She'll change her clothing going to different trances and give messages for her clients who paid for this kut or shamanic ceremony. And at the end of some of these ceremonies, they prepare super sharp chopper blades, put them on the floor, and then they dance on the blades. So I'm observing this. The idea isn't to prove that this is paranormal or not paranormal, but I did check the blades. They're very, very sharp. This is not a hoax. Here's one of my favorite people. This is Will in the Sea. She goes into trance. She puts these skewers through her tongue and cheek. And then she tells jokes, and people laugh. It's a demonstration of pain immunity. Then at the end of the session, she heats up her iron plate red hot. She puts her bare foot on it and then touches her foot to the infirm places on people's body. There's a spiritual healing component. Here's fire walking in Mount Takao in Japan. I participated in this. I participated in firewalking in Sri Lanka. And then I conducted firewalking workshops in Okinawa and in the United States. And here I'm walking on a red hot fire bed with a temperature measuring 888 degrees. And I've walked on other fire beds which approach 1,000 degrees Fahrenheit. So we're not proving anything paranormal is happening, but we're demonstrating what shamanic practitioners can do. So I've done research observing the Society for Research on Rapport and Telekinesis. They do table tipping. The table comes up in the air. Then sometimes they observe the table levitating and they take photographs of it. They contacted J.B. Rhine. He sent William Edward Cox to investigate. Cox prepared this sealed enclosed glass container, and it has micro switches on the floor. So if an object moves, then it switches on the film camera. Here's a film that shows these leather rings linking, and they also have films showing objects moving around inside and moving in and out of the glass container, and pinwheels turning inside the glass case. But there's a lot of trickster effects and ambiguity, and so this research was rejected by the parapsychologists because they conducted an experiment where they didn't bother or worry about the rapport, and so they didn't get the results, so they considered that a failure to replicate. Well, here's my quote from Yogi Berra, famous USA baseball player. He says, "You can observe a lot by just watching, con solo mirar." So I hypothesize that Paleolithic people discovered ways to induce group anomalous experience. Ancient people from 50,000 years ago had the capacity to do very clear cases of symbolization, and many anthropologists argue that shamanic practices have been going on for at least 70,000 years. So here's my theory regarding this, a ritual healing theory. Shamanic rituals produce hypnotic and placebo effects, and that's due to absorption, dissociation, and hypnotic processes. And those variables are correlated with anomalous experience. And anomalous experiences lead to belief, according to this theory, and belief results in shamanic rituals. So we have this cycle going on for 70,000 years and having an evolutionary impact and selecting for genotypes associated with absorption and dissociation. So we have been shaped by shamanism to have the present modern day propensity for spirituality and religiosity. So the present studies going to focus on this part of the theory. Anomalous experiences lead to belief, which leads to shamanic rituals. First, let's look into Bachelor's theory regarding how PK works. He took part in table tipping experiments. He argued that some people, especially dissociative people, engage in subconsciously pushing the table in the dark, and then everyone feels the table moving around and they can't explain it, the ones who aren't pushing, and even the ones who are, perhaps. And that results in reducing the characteristics that reduce the PK, fear of psi and resistance to believing that you're the source of the psi. So exposure to the artifacts overcomes these inhibitions and generates belief, and belief facilitates authentic PK. Now, Bachelor got very good results with these experiments. The table moved around a lot, even had forms of levitation, but he found that tightening the controls seemed to reduce the PK. So he revised his theory. He talks about a universal creative principle that maintains normal reality, and he argued that group belief operates within pockets of indeterminacy where artifacts are possible, and then that makes PK possible. So this differs from standard parapsychological paradigms. He feels that PK is a localized disruption of the shared, normal, or consensual reality. Then there's been an extension of that idea conducted in Toronto. The researchers got together. They devised a fictional story about a British aristocrat whose mistress was burned at the stake as a witch, and he failed to speak up. And according to the fictional story, he committed suicide. And so this created a fictional spirit, which they called upon to produce table levitations and rapping sounds. And sure enough, they were able to communicate with the spirit and the story. It would seem that the story seemed to shape and facilitate the group experience. In other words, the findings that they observed fit the story which they had developed. So that shows that the importance of the story. And there's been alternate attempts to replicate this experiment with alternate stories, and they also have gotten effects. So I made attempts in 1982, 86, 92, and 98 to replicate Bachelor's work, but I didn't get any success. And I communicated with him until he died in 1988. He said it's easy, but I did not find that to be the case. But in 2019, I put together this group online experiment, and we used blink cameras and published an article in the Journal of Scientific Exploration. And here's our experimental protocol. We have 3 pinwheels. We've given them names. Here's Alice, Lefty, Smiley. We have 2 blink cameras. If there's any turning of the pinwheels, these cameras will activate and they'll record the conversation that's going on. Here's a cell phone camera. The people in the group, in the online group, can observe these pinwheels. Here, we've had poltergeist phenomena in people's houses. So here's artifacts from those events. We have religious objects that protect us from demons. We closed off the vent in the room. There's a curtain over the window. I have a mobile. If there's any air movement in the room, this mobile will turn. In the past, I've had mirrors up here so I can capture that occurring, but it's only occurred once, and the mobiles moved, but the pinwheels stayed still. So it's there's been a lot of strange experiences going on. We started off covering Lefty with this plastic dome, and it doesn't turn, but covered by the dome. So that supports Bachelador's arguments. But I would take the cover off, and during our experiments, that's what the turning looks like. And it's been very, very clear. In the early days, it was very, very clear. The group meets and the turning starts. The group stops and the turning ends. Now, over time, it's become less clear. Well, one hypothesis is that the heat from the cameras caused the turning, so we tried covering over the blink camera and the cell phone camera, and the turning continues. So, but not when covered by the dome. So it would seem that hypothesis doesn't explain the turning. I got a journal article published fairly recently in 2024 and had these two hypotheses: the group meeting hypothesis, that the pinwheels will turn while the group's meeting more so than when they're not turning, highly significant results. Then a conversation content hypothesis that seemed that the turning was stronger when we were discussing certain topics: psychical research, anomalous experience, occult traditions, and psychic readings. And that hypothesis was also strongly supported. Then we also had a subjective impression that observation seems to thwart the turning. So that required us to do coding of the conversations. And here's my guidelines for psychical research, anomalous experience, occult traditions, psychic readings. Now, I wanted to code emotions, but I couldn't come up with a valid and reliable system. So we're going to compare anything which is not in these categories is coded as miscellaneous. And then we also code when we remark about seeing the pinwheels turn or observing them, then that's coded as observation. So here's our hypotheses for this experimental series from February 23 to February 24. Hypothesis 1, the group meeting hypothesis. Number 2, direct observation hypothesis, the idea that our observation should thwart the turning, and the conversation content hypothesis. Now, Eric Dullen suggested that I place a pinwheel inside an inverted dome, and it's open so the skeptics won't be so disturbed if it does turn. So our hypothesis of the turning is possible, but it should be reduced compared to these other pinwheels. But that isn't what happened. We put it in the dome, and this was the one that was turning. These stayed still. So that's surprising. But the cameras wouldn't activate. So I purchased a special blink camera. I installed it right next there, and everything stopped happening. But we had anomalous lights occurring while I was out of town. Then this was turning so strongly, I put this full covering, and it stopped immediately. I removed the covering. Alice then became active, and we had 85 activations. I put a 3/4 covering over. Alice stopped. I put a half covering. Alice started turning again. I moved it to 3/4. Alice stopped. Then we began the present experimental series, and with a half covering, and Alice was turning, but only during outside of the experimental sessions, not during the experiments. So I covered. So the theory is maybe this camera, the heat from the camera caused the turning, so we covered it over with a glass dome, and that stopped the turning. So we have blue symbolizes things that support the believer's hypothesis, and red is skeptical hypothesis. We took away this dome, and we had this huge burst of 147 activities and everything. This is the way we've been doing the experiment for the rest of the series. So here's our YouTube videos, which describe all 42 experiments. These early experiments, we had the domes in place, and all these experiments, there was no plastic. Here's a chart that shows this burst of activity when we moved all the domes, and we had another burst and a lot of activity towards the end of the series. So here's our experimental evaluation of the group meeting hypothesis. With the 6-day average, the same time periods, we had about 13 activations. During the experiments, we had an average of about 66. So it's highly significant and it's a very high effect size. Let's look at the conversation coding. While we were observing, the faster turns occurred 45% of the time, and when we weren't observing, 34%. So this is opposite the predicted direction and statistically significant. So that doesn't coincide with our prediction. You might argue that maybe we are overcoming our resistance or getting over our fear of psi. I don't know, but it's possible. Hypothesis 3, the content of our conversation. You notice that there's certain types of conversation which is associated with a lot of rapid turning, psychical research and occult traditions. Overall, these two figures are the difference is statistically significant, highly so, and so that supports hypothesis number 3. So here's our summary. Pinwheel turning occurred more often when the group was meeting. Observation did not thwart the pinwheel turning in certain conversation topics, like psychical research and occult traditions. Those were associated with rapid pinwheel turning. Then we have subjective observations. Our poltergeist experiences affected our belief. And I had poltergeist events in my house, and so did other people, and it affects you. The pinwheels seem to participate in the group conversations. For example, they had not been turning for 24 hours, and then during our group meeting, I mentioned that my brother had died a year before, and immediately started turning it. It affects your belief when things like that happen. It seems more than just coincidental. Many of our experiments failed. Like, for example, we tried to call up the spirit or something like that. It didn't work. We weren't very successful in shouting at the pinwheels and getting them to turn, except for one occasion. And there were a lot of trickster effects, equipment failures, changes in the pinwheel turning patterns, and poltergeist events. And it seemed like it had a creative capacity. For example, we have these anomalous lights. Now, this is a very, very overcast day. It's very, very dark in the room. And then we have this light shining, pulsing, and being documented by activating the blink camera. And that was the result that occurred there on July 25th, 2022. Here's another event that occurred in 24. And the window's blocked off with a blanket, but we have this light shining and pulsating on the meditation altar. And so here's our qualitative research plan. Here's another example of another light. The light has different patterns, so that's the form. What I did was devise a criteria for selecting the psychical research and occult tradition weak turn and strong turn samples. So I've got to compare two groups of sample turns. I assemble the samples, and I'm looking for factors that differentiate. And I want to consider how the strong turn narratives seem to advocate a particular ideology. They seem to offer a kind of story and affect our belief systems in a particular direction. So here's an example of a weak turn in the narrative that was occurring.
I guess we should use something like a pendulum. We have to. No, we have to. It's like an order telling us to. At least that's my interpretation. When we mentioned the pendulum, they all started to move.
So the weak turns tended to refer to methodology. Here's our strongest turn during the entire year.
Imagine what that, wrap our mind around it, and maybe after we die, we are able to do that. We think in way more dimensions, not only fourth or fifth, but so many dimensions there are, and suddenly we will be able to really
have a story about life after, the concept of life after death. So here's our weak turn sample. We have this methodological idea, use a pendulum. You heard that one. Then other ideas, making videos, or a difficulty about talking psychical research, and hypotheses about synchronicity, and a variety of occult traditions. But they all have kind of a narrow focus. And but our strong turn sample has a very broad focus, a general ideology talking about life after death, and then there's a lot of discussion, stories about people. Ingo Swann, Russell Targ, Ingo Swann, the deaths of Ingo Swann and Pat Price, wrote viewers. My travels with Hans Bender, and then a rejection of Surratt by the parapsychologist. Then all the occult traditions were all the same topic about this star knowledge, which is an Native American Lakota Sioux tradition, thinking of the ideas of human souls being connected to stars and ancient alien visitors and synchronicities. And so we have that phenomena, the linking of the strong turning with a particular set of ideas. So we're providing the ideas. So that kind of coincides with Durkheim's theory. Religion's a reflection of our thinking, of our gathering. But I want you to think about shamanism and what's been going on for 70,000 years. People have been gathering around fires. Their experience is quite different from our metaphor experiment here. We're strangers, we're gathering online. So we should expect that our ideologies will differ from shamanism. But if the phenomena is the same, then maybe there's physiological factors. Here's a story that comes together from gathering all those narratives. And here's our magical phenomena, which seems to support this story. A spiritual reality encompassing physical reality entails interconnectedness of everything: life after death, human stories, spirits, magic, and the cosmos. This knowledge is hidden. It's hidden because you need to be a part of the group really to be exposed to this event, this story, this ideology which seems to be emerging. This isn't for outsiders. The story is for the people who are huddled around the fire or who are in our group. So here's a theory development within the sociology of religion. We're offering a proto-ideology number one. Suppose this experiment were done in Mexico. They'd probably come to something a little bit different, but there'd be similarities because if the physiology of the phenomena is the same. Suppose it were done in Brazil. Suppose the experiment were done in Iran or in the People's Republic of China. Well, would there be competition and synthesis, and we end up with an innovative ideology? So here's our conclusions. These findings support Batchelor's model. They support the ritual healing theory. They support theory development, and that group experience is changed. It's affected by this innovative experience, this anomalous experience, and resulting in innovative ideology. So here's my references. You might take note of the ones in red. They pertain to the trickster effect. And if you would like to participate, contact me by email, beinghere@gmail.com.